There is a moment when a person realizes that the life they have been carefully building has been quietly dismantled around them, not through catastrophe, not through storm or sudden loss, not through the kind of clean, declarative ending that at least has the decency to announce itself, but through the slow, deliberate work of someone who shared their bed, their table, their dreams, someone who looked them in the eye every morning and chose, with full intention and full knowledge of what they were doing, to betray them. The particular cruelty of that kind of betrayal is not its violence. It is its patience, the way it wears the face of partnership while quietly preparing its opposite. For Daniel Reeves, that moment arrived on a Tuesday morning in March in the parking lot of the business he had built from nothing, standing in the gray early spring cold in front of a door that had been rekeyed overnight. His key no longer worked. His badge had been deactivated, not malfunctioned, not expired, but deliberately, specifically deactivated by someone who had the authorization to do so and who had exercised that authorization sometime between when Daniel had left the night before and when he arrived that morning with a travel mug of coffee and a mind already running through the week's delivery schedule. The security code he had programmed himself on a Saturday afternoon 3 years earlier with the installation technician now returned a single red light and a flat, mechanical beep, the sound of a system doing exactly what it had been instructed to do, which was to tell Daniel Reeves that he no longer belonged here. He stood there for 4 minutes, not because he was confused, not because he needed time to understand the mechanics of what had happened. He understood immediately. He stood there because he was making a decision about how to carry what he now understood, and decisions of that magnitude deserve a moment of stillness. Even in a cold parking lot, even with your breath making small clouds, and air the color of old pewter, even when every instinct in your body is pulling in 3 different directions at once. When the 4 minutes were over, he pulled out his phone. Not to call Vanessa, not to call the security company. He called his attorney. His wife, Vanessa, had made her move. And she believed, with the total confidence of someone who had planned carefully and moved first, that she had won. She was wrong. Pause. She was wrong in the way that people are most profoundly wrong, not about tactics, but about the nature of the thing they were competing for. She had understood the battle perfectly and misunderstood the terrain entirely. If you find something worth holding in stories about patience, precision, and the kind of quiet justice that arrives, not like a thunderclap, but like a tide, slow, impossible to argue with, unstoppable in the way that only inevitable things are unstoppable, then stay with this one all the way through. Hit that like button before we go any further, because this story earns it. And if you are watching from somewhere in the world where mornings still carry a chill and the coffee is doing its best to help, drop your location in the comments. We build something together here, one story at a time, and knowing where you are is part of that. Now let us go back to the beginning, because the beginning matters enormously. The beginning is where you understand not just what Daniel lost temporarily and what he never lost at all, but what he built and how he built it, and, most importantly, why the method of the building was the very thing that made it impossible to steal. Daniel Reeves grew up in a modest household in a mid-sized city where the industrial sector had been slowly dying for a generation, the kind of place where everyone his parents' age seemed to be quietly mourning a version of economic life that had receded the way a tide recedes, not all at once, but steadily. Until one morning you look out and the waterline is somewhere you no longer recognize. His father had worked at a manufacturing plant for 22 years before it closed. His mother cleaned commercial offices, 3 buildings, 5 mornings a week, for 11 years. Neither of them had attended college. Both of them worked with a dignity and a consistency and a fundamental seriousness of purpose that Daniel absorbed so completely, so early, that he did not even understand until much later in his life that this was something he had been given as deliberately as any inheritance. A foundation, a set of values operating at a depth so far below the surface that they did not function as beliefs so much as they functioned as bone, structural, load-bearing, invisible until tested. He studied business at a state university, the tuition paid for mostly through student loans, and the wages from a weekend job at a restaurant supply warehouse on the eastern edge of the city. A job he had taken because it was available and kept because it turned out to teach him more about the industry he would eventually inhabit than any classroom managed to. What he learned there was not accounting or marketing or operations theory, though he learned those things in his coursework. What he learned at the warehouse was something more fundamental and, in the long run, far more valuable. He learned that the entire infrastructure of the food service industry ran on relationships, not contracts, not spreadsheets, not terms and conditions, relationships. The distributor who genuinely liked you gave you better lead times because he wanted to, not because he was contractually obligated to. The supplier who respected you absorbed a supply shock so that you didn't have to, because she knew you would do the same for her if the situation reversed. The vendor who trusted you extended payment terms when your cash flow tightened because he had decided over years of consistent dealing that your word was collateral worth accepting. Every supply chain Daniel came to understand was ultimately a chain of human decisions. And human decisions were governed not by the fine print of agreements, but by how people felt about the person on the other end of the phone at 7 o'clock on a Wednesday morning when something had gone wrong. He filed that knowledge away with the careful attention he gave to everything that seemed true and durable, and he went on. After graduating, he spent 5 years working for a regional food distribution company, rising with quiet steadiness from a junior logistics coordinator to a senior account manager, overseeing a client portfolio worth roughly $4 million in annual volume. He was good at the work in the ways you might expect: technically precise, operationally detail-oriented, strategically patient, and he was exceptional at it in a way that cannot be taught in any program or developed through any curriculum. He genuinely liked people, not in a performed, professionally strategic way. He was actually curious about them. He actually listened. When they talked about the problems they were trying to solve, he actually remembered the name of the restaurant owner's daughter who had started culinary school. And he asked about her 3 months later because he had made a note and the note had reminded him, but also because he wanted to know. In an industry that often rewarded volume and speed and the aggressive confidence of the loudest voice in the room, Daniel succeeded because he was the most reliably present person in every room he entered. And reliability, genuine, consistent, years deep reliability, is worth more in distribution than almost any other quality you could name. He met Vanessa during his 3rd year at the distribution company, at an industry mixer that he had almost skipped because the week had been long and his instinct was always to go home rather than extend an already extended day. He went because a colleague had asked him to, and because he had learned early that the events you almost skip are sometimes the ones that matter. Vanessa was working in marketing for a regional hospitality group, and she was, there was no other word that came close, magnetic. Sharp and stylish, and possessed of a social fearlessness that Daniel, who was capable and confident in operational settings, but naturally reserved in purely social ones, found both genuinely impressive and, if he was honest with himself, somewhat intoxicating. She could walk into any room and within 20 minutes know everyone's name, their professional context, their current ambitions, and at least one personal detail that would make them feel seen. She made events feel like opportunities and made meetings feel like parties. And she was funny in the specific way that people who are also intelligent are funny, not at others' expense, but at the expense of the gap between how things are presented and how they actually are. They dated for 18 months. They married in a ceremony that her parents largely planned and largely funded, a detail Daniel noted without complaint or resentment because he understood that the Hargrove family Vanessa's parents, Gerald and Marlene, had strong and specific aesthetic preferences and the financial means to execute them elaborately. And he had neither the desire to compete with that nor any particular vision of his own that he felt was being overridden. It was their daughter's wedding. He wanted her to be happy. He attended fittings and tastings and venue walkthroughs with an accommodating good humor that Vanessa appreciated visibly, and he thought no more about it. Gerald and Marlene Hargrove were successful in the regional real estate market, not the level of success that makes the news, but the comfortable, entrenched kind that comes from 30 years of buying, developing, and managing properties in a market you understand thoroughly. They were also, without ever being overtly hostile or confrontational, persistently condescending toward Daniel, not in ways that made good stories, not in ways that you could point to afterward and say clearly that was the thing that happened, in ways that accumulated. A comment at Thanksgiving, delivered with a sympathetic tilt of the head about the reliability of his car. A question at Christmas about whether his employer offered a pension, with a tone that suggested the answer was already assumed to be disappointing. A raised eyebrow, Gerald's particular instrument of dismissal, when Daniel mentioned over a Sunday dinner that he was thinking seriously about starting his own operation. The eyebrow that said, without requiring words and without leaving any evidence, "You? Really? With what? Starting from where?" Vanessa never challenged them. She laughed at the moments when laughter served as redirection, guided conversations away from the surface of tension towards safer conversational ground, and, later, in the car or at home, assured Daniel that her parents were simply blunt people, that it was cultural, that he was perhaps reading more into certain moments than was there to be read. Daniel, who wanted peace and who believed genuinely in the charitable interpretation of ambiguous behavior, accepted this framing for a long time, far longer, if he is honest, than the evidence warranted. He accepted it because the alternative that the people his wife loved were unkind to him, with her knowledge and her silence as their permission structure, was a more complicated truth to live with, and he was busy. He was busy because something was growing. 2 years into the marriage, Daniel left the distribution company. He did it carefully, with adequate notice and without burning a single bridge, maintaining every supplier relationship and every client connection he had built during 5 years of diligent work. He took $80,000 in personal savings, every dollar he had accumulated over a decade of careful living below his income, the product of a discipline so quiet and consistent that most people in his life had not fully understood its scale. And he launched Reeve Supply & Co., a specialized food service distribution operation focused on independent restaurants, boutique, hotel properties, and small catering businesses. Specifically, the kinds of clients that the large regional distributors either ignored or served so poorly that they had effectively created a vacancy in the market, a gap between what was available and what was genuinely needed that Daniel could see with perfect clarity, because he had spent 5 years watching it from the supply side. The gap was real. The need was documented. And Daniel, with his accumulated relationship capital, his operational knowledge of the mechanics of food service distribution, and his deep, concrete understanding of what small operators actually required and what they were not receiving, was precisely the right person to step into that gap at exactly the right moment. He knew it. He had known it, quietly and without allowing himself to name it, prematurely for the better part of a year before he made the move. The first year was brutal in the way that all first years are brutal for businesses that are trying to build something real rather than just something fast. He operated out of a leased commercial space, barely large enough to qualify as a warehouse, with a loading dock that required patience to navigate, and a refrigeration system that he had replaced at his own expense because the previous tenant had not maintained it and he was not willing to compromise on cold chain integrity for a single delivery. He drove routes himself on Saturdays and sometimes Sundays. He answered supplier emails at midnight and client calls at 6:30 in the morning. He negotiated payment terms with 7 key suppliers, that allowed him to carry necessary inventory without destroying the cash position he had entered with, leveraging entirely on the trust he had already established over years of being exactly who he presented himself to be, every single time, without exception. Vanessa helped in the early period, and Daniel acknowledged that help specifically and gratefully. Her instincts in marketing and visual presentation were genuine and practically useful. She designed the original logo, built the initial website with a clarity and visual intelligence that Daniel admired, drafted the first round of client outreach materials in language that was precise and warm, and did not oversell what the company could deliver. She sat with him at the kitchen table on Sunday evenings and worked through the messaging for new client pitches. He brought her into decisions because he respected her perspective and because he believed, with the complete sincerity of a man who had not yet been given sufficient reason to believe otherwise, that what they were building together. When they incorporated the business, he gave her 49% of the equity to his 51%. His attorney at the time, a careful woman named Helen Marsh, who would later become significantly more important to this story, had gently suggested this structure rather than an even 50-50 split, noting with professional understatement that maintaining clear majority ownership would simplify decision-making in any future operational disputes. Daniel had nodded, accepted the structure, and privately dismissed the concern as standard boilerplate caution. They were married. The business was their shared project. The 1% difference between majority and minority ownership was a legal technicality that would never matter between two people who trusted each other. Helen Marsh had made a note in the file. By the end of year 3, Reeves Supply Company was profitable. Not dramatically profitable. The margins in specialized food service distribution are real, but not lavish, but sustainably, structurally profitable, in a way that indicates a business model that works and a customer base that is satisfied enough to stay. By the end of year 5, the company was generating just over $2 million in annual revenue with a client roster of 43 independent restaurant operations and 11 boutique hotel properties, 3 full-time employees, a network of contracted delivery drivers, and 7 primary supplier relationships that Daniel managed personally. With the attentiveness and consistency that had characterized every professional relationship he had ever maintained, the business worked because Daniel worked it, and because of the relationships. Always, in the end, always the relationships. During those 5 years, Vanessa's involvement in the business had evolved in a direction that Daniel noticed, but for a long time interpreted charitably. In the first year and the second, she had been genuinely present and genuinely useful. By year 3, her engagement had become more selective, more focused on the elements she found interesting, the marketing materials, the visual identity, the client events, and less present in the operational realities she found either tedious or stressful. By year 4, her involvement in the day-to-day running of Reeves Supply and Company had contracted to something close to nominal. Her professional energy redirected toward her parents' real estate ventures and a social orbit that Daniel increasingly noticed was not structured around or even particularly inclusive of him. He told himself reasonable things, that this was a natural evolution, that as the business matured, it required less of the marketing creative energy she brought and more of the operational management he provided, that she was establishing her own professional identity in a field she understood intuitively, that marriages accommodate parallel professional lives all the time without anything being fundamentally wrong. He told himself all of these things because they were plausible and because the alternative required a kind of courage he was not quite ready to summon, which was the courage to look at what was actually in front of him rather than what he preferred to see. What was actually in front of him, though Daniel did not yet have all the pieces of it, was not mutual drift. It was not parallel development. It was directed movement. Vanessa was moving towards something and towards someone with a deliberateness and a purposefulness that could not be honestly described as anything other than what it was. His name was Marcus Holt. He was a real estate developer with connections threaded through the Hargrove family's professional network, possessed of the kind of performative wealth, the curated wardrobe, the conspicuously expensive vehicle, the restaurants chosen for their ability to be mentioned afterward, that Vanessa had always found compelling and that Daniel had always recognized in the way that people recognize things they choose not to act on as a particular kind of language that she responded to. The affair had apparently been ongoing for approximately 7 months by the time Daniel discovered it. He did not discover it through a confrontation or a found message or a dramatic moment of exposure. He discovered it through a phone call on a Wednesday evening from his bookkeeper, Patricia, a practical and meticulous woman in her early 50s who had been managing the company's accounts for 4 years and who called him with a tone of voice that communicated, before she had said anything of substance, that something had gone genuinely and seriously wrong. Patricia had noticed, as careful bookkeepers notice such things, a pattern in the company's financial activity over the preceding several weeks that had no legitimate operational explanation. A series of transfers, modest individually, significant in aggregate, moving to a separate account opened under Vanessa's name alone. Invoice approvals for vendor relationships that Daniel had not established and that Patricia could not find corresponding to any inventory or service the company had received. And a payment, a substantial one, to a law firm that Patricia had searched and found listed as specializing in business litigation and asset protection. Vanessa was not, as it turned out, planning a conventional exit from the marriage. She was planning to take the business. The structure of the plan, which Daniel pieced together over the following 2 weeks in a series of increasingly detailed meetings with Helen Marsh, who had retained the original incorporation file and who listened to Daniel's account with the focused, carefully neutral attention of an attorney who is simultaneously analyzing a legal situation and suppressing a strong reaction to it, was sophisticated in its mechanics and audacious in its ambition. Vanessa intended to petition for judicial supervision of the business partnership, arguing that her contributions as a 49% co-owner had been systematically undervalued, and that Daniel had operationally marginalized her involvement over the preceding 2 years, effectively making business decisions without adequate consultation of a nearly equal equity partner. This argument, her legal team clearly believed, was sufficient to support an application for a temporary restraining order that would give her operational control of Reeves Supply & Company pending a full business valuation and formal buyout proceeding. The plan did not need to succeed on its ultimate merits. Helen was explicit about this in her assessment, leaning forward slightly in her chair in a way that told Daniel she wanted him to understand this point completely. It only needed to succeed well enough to sustain itself. If Vanessa could establish operational control, even temporarily, and even under judicial supervision, she could use the company's revenue to fund protracted litigation, could create sufficient operational disruption to damage the supplier and client relationships that constituted the company's actual value, and could ultimately force Daniel into a settlement far below the company's real worth simply because. The alternative, fighting a long and expensive legal battle while watching the business deteriorate around the dispute, would become untenable. The lock change on that Tuesday morning in March was the plan's first physical expression. Vanessa had obtained the temporary restraining order. The rekeyed door was the opening move of the endgame, announced not with a conversation, but with a red light and a flat mechanical beep in a cold parking lot. Daniel stood in that parking lot for 4 minutes, as already noted, and then he called Helen. What followed that call over the next 48 hours was the moment when the strategy that Vanessa and her legal team had constructed began to encounter the reality that they had failed to account for. After speaking with Helen, Daniel called Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb was the owner of Webb Fresh Provisions, the single largest supplier in Daniel's network, providing roughly 38% of the total inventory that Reeves Supply Co. sourced and distributed. They had a working relationship of 4 years' duration that was formally documented in a supplier agreement and informally grounded in something considerably more durable than paper. It was grounded in the particular accumulated history of a relationship where one person had consistently shown up, consistently delivered on commitments, consistently treated the other party's operational needs as his own problem rather than their problem, and had done these things not strategically or in calculated anticipation of a future moment when the investment would be called in, but simply because that was how Daniel Reeves operated with every person in his professional life, every single time, without variation. There had been a Saturday morning 2 years earlier when a cold storage equipment failure threatened to compromise a weekend delivery to 3 of Web Fresh Provisions' best downstream accounts. Daniel had been on his own loading dock at 5:45 in the morning coordinating alternative cold storage arrangements, absorbing the logistical cost of the equipment failure personally rather than passing it to Marcus, and had managed to execute the deliveries on schedule. He had not told Marcus about the failure until after the deliveries were made. When he did, he described it factually and briefly, with no suggestion that a reciprocal favor had been accumulated. Marcus had listened, thanked him, and remembered it with the particular clarity with which we remember moments that reveal character unambiguously. There had also been a handwritten note sent on plain notepaper in an envelope with a physical stamp when Marcus's father died in the autumn of the previous year. Not an email. A note in Daniel's actual handwriting that said the things that matter in such moments and did not say anything else. The phone call lasted 11 minutes. Daniel explained the situation with the same factual, unemotional precision he applied to logistics problems, the legal action, the structure of what Vanessa was attempting, the operational implications of a management transition to someone with no operational knowledge of the business, the almost certain requirement under Vanessa's plan to establish new supplier contacts and renegotiate terms from zero. He did not ask Marcus for anything directly. He stated what was true and described what he anticipated would happen and let Marcus draw his own conclusions. When Daniel finished, there was a silence of approximately 5 seconds. "You're telling me," Marcus said, "that someone who does not know this business is about to try to run it." "That is what I am telling you," Daniel said. Another silence, shorter than the first. "Not one more delivery," Marcus said. "Not until this is resolved, and I am speaking to you directly. I will put that in writing today, and you will have it before noon." Daniel closed his eyes. The morning cold was still present, the gray light not yet resolved into anything warmer. "I want you to understand," he said carefully, "that this creates a difficult situation for you, and I would not think less of you for needing time to consider it." "I have had 11 minutes, Marcus said. That was sufficient time. The note arrived, as promised, before noon. It was professionally worded, legally careful, and absolute in its effect. What Marcus did in the following 48 hours went beyond his own account hold. He contacted, through existing industry relationships, 3 of the 6 remaining primary suppliers in Daniel's network. He did not tell them what to do. He shared what he understood to be happening, accurately and without embellishment, and he made sure they had the full picture before the situation reached them through other channels. He was, in the most precise sense, doing what people do when they genuinely trust someone and that someone is under threat. He made sure the people who should know knew. Within 48 hours of the parking lot morning, 5 of the 7 primary suppliers had communicated through various channels that Reeves Supply Cone accounts were on hold, pending clarification of the management situation. The communications were professional and carefully worded. Their collective effect was not: without supply, there was no product to distribute. Without product, there were no deliveries. Without deliveries, there was no business. Vanessa discovered this on Thursday morning when she arrived at the office that her rekeyed door now opened without resistance and found the operations manager, her attorney's business consultant, had recommended sitting in front of a screen displaying a cascade of hold notifications. A phone was ringing with calls from restaurant and hotel clients asking where their scheduled deliveries were and no answer to give them that would help. By Thursday afternoon, 3 clients had contacted their secondary suppliers to cover unmet delivery needs, and in food service distribution, engaging a secondary supplier to cover a gap is often the first step toward that supplier becoming the primary supplier, because the relationships in this business, like all relationships, follow the path of demonstrated reliability. Vanessa called Daniel at 4:17 on Thursday afternoon. He did not answer. He was sitting across from Helen Marsh, reviewing documents and planning the response to the temporary restraining order. Vanessa left a voicemail that attempted in 47 seconds to be simultaneously threatening and conciliatory, and succeeded at neither, the two intentions undermining each other in the way that contradictory strategies always do under genuine pressure. The voicemail revealed more clearly than any deposition could have the precise dimensions of her panic. Helen listened to it twice and made a note. The legal process that followed was not swift. Nothing in commercial litigation is swift, and anyone constructing a narrative that suggests otherwise is editing out the grinding, expensive, emotionally depleting reality of what it actually means to contest something formally and thoroughly in a legal proceeding. Daniel spent 8 months in that process. He spent money he had not budgeted or anticipated spending. He sat across negotiating tables from Vanessa and her legal team on multiple occasions and observed, with a steadiness that seemed to increasingly unsettle the people across from him, the systematic dismantling of the strategy that had been built against him, because the strategy had been constructed on a foundational assumption that turned out to be false, that the business would continue to operate under Vanessa's control during litigation, generating revenue that would sustain the legal effort and simultaneously demonstrate her operational capacity to a court. Without supply, the business could not operate in any meaningful sense. Without operation, there was no revenue. Without revenue, the litigation became a financial contest that Vanessa, who had moved assets, but had not yet converted those movements into liquid resources she could freely deploy, could not sustain at the pace that effective commercial litigation requires. Simultaneously, Patricia, the bookkeeper's careful, methodical documentation of financial irregularities provided Helen with a detailed and specific evidentiary record that proved far more powerful in the proceedings than a more general account of misappropriation would have been. The asset transfers were identified, traced through 3 account movements, and legally challenged on grounds of breach of fiduciary duty to the company. The payments to unrecognized vendors were examined individually, and several were found to lack any corresponding legitimate business expense. They were, in the plain language of the final findings, fabricated. The petition for judicial supervision was contested with documented evidence comparing Vanessa's actual involvement in company operations over the preceding 2 years, which Helen characterized with precise understatement as substantially below the operational participation level one would associate with active co-management against Daniels. Talk comprehensive, documented daily management of every material aspect of the business. Gerald and Marlene Hargrove attended one mediation session, apparently in the belief that their physical presence and the implicit weight of family solidarity would create a social pressure that would soften Daniel's position. Gerald made a statement about Daniel being unreasonable. Marlene suggested, with the particular confidence of someone who has never needed to examine the consistency of her own positions, that a fair man would recognize the genuine contributions Vanessa had made to the business's early success. Helen Marsh regarded them with the politely impenetrable expression of a person who has spent 2.5 decades in commercial litigation and has heard every variation of this argument delivered by people who ranged from genuinely aggrieved too strategically theatrical, too simply bewildered that the world was not responding to them as it usually did. "With respect," she said, her tone carrying both the warmth and the absolute firmness of someone who means every word of the sentence that follows, "Your daughter's contributions to the business are documented in the record with considerable specificity. So, is their timeline. Their period of active contribution is also documented. We are entirely prepared to review all of that documentation in whatever level of detail would be useful." Gerald and Marlene did not speak again during that session. The settlement arrived 8 months after the parking lot morning. It was not the settlement Vanessa had designed the plan to produce. Her 49% equity stake was bought out at a valuation that reflected the company's performance during the dispute period, a period during which the operational disruption caused substantially by her own legal strategy had reduced both revenue and client count, rather than at the higher valuation that would have applied had the business been functioning normally at the time of assessment. The asset transfers were challenged, and approximately 63% of the transferred value was recovered through the legal proceedings, a partial recovery that Helen described as solid, given the complexity of tracing assets moved through multiple accounts over several months. The divorce ran as a parallel proceeding through separate filings and was concluded in the same general period. Vanessa walked away with money, less than the strategy had promised her, less than she had believed the business was worth to her in financial terms, and none of the company. On the morning the final settlement documents were signed, Daniel drove to the parking lot of Reeves Supplying Company and sat in his car for a few minutes before going in. The same parking lot, the same building, its exterior unremarkable in the early morning light, but a different season entirely, the spring of the following year, almost exactly 13 months removed from the morning of the red light and the flat mechanical beep. The cold that had been present then was gone, replaced by the particular quality of a March morning that had finally decided it was done being winter. The light, not yet warm but clear, in a way that felt like the opening of something rather than the continuation of something difficult. He sat and thought about the person who had stood in that same space 12 months earlier, breath fogging in the gray cold, holding a key that no longer worked. He did not feel triumph. Triumph is loud and requires an audience, and what Daniel felt was quieter and more durable than triumph and required nothing external to sustain it. He felt the particular peace that arrives when you discover, through the most difficult test available, that you are exactly the person you had believed yourself to be, that what you built was built the way you believed it was built, that the foundations held because they were, in fact, what you had laid them to be. He went inside and called Marcus Webb. "It is done," he said. "Good," Marcus said without preamble. "I have a new pricing sheet to walk you through. Better terms across 3 categories. You have earned them, and I should have offered them 6 months ago." The suppliers returned all 7. The clients who had shifted their business to secondary suppliers during the disruption period were individually contacted, each call made personally by Daniel, each conversation conducted without complaint or editorializing about what had caused the disruption. He explained that the situation was resolved, that operations were stable, and that he would like to earn their business back. He won 3 of the 5 back within 4 months. The other 2 he did not recover. He accepted this without bitterness and without self-deception. Those 2 clients were the real material cost of what had happened, the cost that no settlement document could address or reverse, and he added them to his honest accounting of what the preceding year had taken. What the year had given was harder to name, but considerably easier to live with. He rebuilt the client roster with methodical patience, adding 8 new accounts over the 18 months that followed through the same approach that had built the original 43, being exactly who he said he was, doing exactly what he said he would do, remembering the things that mattered to the people across the table. He restructured the company's ownership and governance documents on Helen's recommendation in a way that protected operational decision-making authority, absolutely and without ambiguity, eliminating the structural vulnerability that the original incorporation had left unaddressed. He hired a full-time operations manager, a practical and talented woman named Sandra, who had been managing distribution logistics for a competing company and who had, in her first week at Supply Company, quietly reorganized the scheduling system in a way that reduced delivery errors by 30%, which was exactly the kind of hire Daniel had been deferring for 2 years. While covering too much operational ground himself, he gave Patricia a raise that he should have given her a year earlier. Patricia received it with a nod, and the observation that it was in fact about time, which was the closest Patricia came to personal expression in professional settings. He did not pursue any romantic relationship for close to a year, not from damage and not from bitterness, but from the honest recognition that he owed himself a period of genuine examination before proceeding. He needed to understand clearly and without the comfortable distortions that emotional convenience provides what he had actually missed. The condescension from Gerald and Marlene that he had normalized over years, because naming it would have required a harder conversation with Vanessa than he had been willing to have. The gradual withdrawal of Vanessa's genuine regard, the specific moments when his instincts had spoken clearly and his desire for peace had spoken louder. The choices he had made from a charitable interpretation of evidence that, in retrospect, had not warranted charity. He was not cruel to himself in this examination. He was thorough. He was curious about himself in the way that requires real courage, the courage to look at what is true rather than what is comfortable. And he found several things he did not like, and he sat with them with the same steadiness he had brought to every other difficult thing the year had required of him. And then he adjusted. 18 months after the settlement was signed, he met someone at a regional food service industry conference, a woman named Claire, who operated a mid-sized catering company that worked largely in the corporate event space, who was direct and precise in the way that operators who run businesses successfully tend to be. On the first substantive conversation they had, disagreed with him sharply and in considerable technical detail about cold chain management protocols for fresh shellfish in transit times. She was, as he established when he looked into it afterward, entirely correct. He called her the following week to tell her so. She laughed with the particular openness of someone who is genuinely pleased to be recognized, and said if he wanted to continue the disagreement, she would be available for dinner on Friday. He said he thought Friday would work. They were unhurried with each other in the way that people who have been through enough to know the value of taking their time tend to be. Both of them had learned, through paths that were different in their particulars and similar in their essential shape, that certainty built over time is worth more than certainty arrived at quickly, and that knowing someone fully is a project that deserves the attention you would give to anything you intend to build to last. But this story, though it ends well in the ways that matter, is not ultimately about what came after. What came after was good, and good things that come after hard things deserve to be named as such. But the story's weight, its real substance, lives in what held during the hardest part, and what that holding demonstrated about the nature of what Daniel had built. Because here is the thing that the story actually reveals. Underneath all the legal filings and supplier calls and parking lot mornings, what could not be taken from Daniel Reeves was not, in the final accounting, the business, though the business survived. It was not the supplier network, though the network held. It was not the client relationships, though most of those held too, and the ones that didn't held long enough to be worth trying to recover. What could not be taken from him was the reason those things held. The reason Marcus Webb answered the phone at 7:30 in the morning and made a decision in 11 minutes and put it in writing before noon. The reason Patricia had spent 6 weeks building a meticulous documented record before she made her call. The reason 3 of 5 shifted clients came back when Daniel reached out directly. The reason 7 suppliers, who had every professional right to maintain neutrality in a business dispute, chose not to. Trust cannot be manufactured. It cannot be acquired on a timeline that suits you, or replicated through capital, or substituted by a well-crafted legal argument. Trust is deposited incrementally and without ceremony in the account of another person's regard for you through 10,000 small actions that no one is watching, and no one is evaluating, and no one is formally recording until the moment when it matters. When the crisis arrives and the question is answered not by words, but by the accumulated weight of what was actually built over years of consistent, genuine, unperformed character. Daniel Reeves had spent a decade building that. Quietly, consistently, without strategic intent and without awareness that one day someone would try to take what he had built, and the most important question in the room would be whether the building was solid. Someone tried to take it. What they discovered when they tried was that the most valuable thing he owned could not be transferred to another party, could not be retitled through a legal mechanism, could not be placed on the other side of a rekeyed door. Because it did not live in the building, it lived in people. And people who trusted you, who had arrived at that trust through years of watching you be exactly who you said you were. Those people are not so easily reassigned to someone presenting different credentials and a new business card. Marcus Webb described what had happened simply and precisely in a conversation that Daniel later recounted to a small group of colleagues at a regional industry dinner, the kind of dinner where the food is good and the conversation eventually gets to the things that actually matter. She thought the business was the contracts and the accounts, Marcus said. She believed that if she could secure the company name and the client list and the supplier agreements, she had the business. She did not understand what the business actually was. Someone at the table asked what the business actually was. Marcus looked at Daniel for a moment, not a long look, but a considered one, and then he looked back at the person who had asked. It was the phone calls he made at 6 in the morning when something had gone wrong, Marcus said. It was the notes he sent when someone needed one. It was over a decade of being exactly the same person every single time, in every situation, whether things were going well or things were falling apart. That is not a company. A company is a legal structure. What Daniel built is a reputation, and a reputation cannot be stolen. He picked up his glass and let the sentence finish itself. It can only be spent, he said. The table held its quiet for a moment after that, the particular quiet of people who have been told something true in a way they will carry with them. And if you are sitting with this story right now, in whatever corner of the world you have made your own, I want to ask you something honest. Because this is not only Daniel's story, and you already know that, which is probably part of why you are still here. Most of us have stood in a parking lot of some kind, literal or otherwise, looking at a door that no longer opened the way we expected it to. Most of us have been underestimated by someone who had access to our full history and still chose to see only the surface of us. Most of us have had something we built or something we were, dismissed or competed for, or quietly betrayed by someone who mistook the external structure of a thing for the substance of it. What held for you? What remained when the thing you thought was the foundation turned out not to be, and something deeper took its weight? And who was your Marcus Webb who answered the phone and made a decision before the conversation was over because the years of consistent dealing had made the decision obvious? Drop it in the comments, genuinely. Not because this is a place for performance, but because stories like Daniel's only become fully themselves when they connect to the real and specific experiences of real people who recognize something true in them. Your story matters in this conversation. It completes it. If this one moved something in you, if it gave you that particular satisfaction of watching patience and integrity outlast arrogance and calculation, of watching what is real outlast what is merely asserted, then hit the like button and share it with someone today who needs to be reminded that what they are quietly building is more durable than they might currently believe. Subscribe for more stories like this one, stories where the ending is not handed to anyone but earned, where justice arrives through the accumulated weight of character rather than the drama of a single moment, and where the most powerful thing a person can carry through this life is not what they own, but what they have made of themselves in the regard of the people around them. There are more stories coming. Stories about quiet endurance and long patience, and the kind of justice that does not announce itself loudly because it does not need to, because by the time it arrives, it is already complete and everyone present already knows it. Stay with us for those. They are worth the wait.